Hey, what's up everybody? Platform Disciple here with another Weird Card Wednesday where again we are going to be looking at two cards instead of one because they are worth talking about together. There are only two black counter spells, or I should say mono black counter spells in the game, and I've got one in each hand. Let's see if you guys can guess them before I reveal them. Well, hopefully you've made your guesses at this point, but so the two cards are Dash Hopes and Withering Boon. And to be clear, I am defining counter spells as instants that counter a spell. There are a couple other black cards that do counter things, but they aren't spells, they are permanents. So for example, we have Death Grip here. Very mean card that allows you to counter green spells by playing 2 black, but it's an enchantment, so this card needs to already be on the battlefield. And there's a few other cards like that, only a small handful. I'll just list them off quickly. Nether Void is technically counters spells, but realistically players are just going to pay the cost for it. Stromgeld Cabal is something that can counter spells, and Thrall Wizard also can counter spells, but those cards, because they are each permanents, your opponent can plan around them, so they aren't really the same as these two cards, which your opponent is going to be surprised by. So let's jump into it with Dash Hopes, which is a common that was printed in Planar Chaos and has yet to be reprinted. It's 2 black, it is an instant, and it reads, when you play Dash Hopes, any player may pay 5 life. If a player does, counter Dash Hopes. And its effect is counter target spell. The card, the text has been changed only slightly. The word play has been replaced with cast, and it reads, when you cast this spell, any player may pay 5 life. If a player does, counter Dash Hopes, counter target spell. So mostly the same, but it reads as when you cast this spell, which makes a little more clear that that is in fact a triggered ability. It's not part of the effect of Dash Hopes. That means that when you cast Dash Hopes and it goes on the stack, before Dash Hopes resolves, a triggered ability goes on the stack. And that triggered ability can be interacted with like any other triggered ability, which means that you could stifle Dash Hope's triggered ability to prevent it from happening, making this a 2 black counter target spell. Admittedly, you'd be using a stifle in the process, so probably not what you want to do with the card, but it's just worth noting that that is a triggered ability. Also, it's worth noting that this card interacts interestingly when you have cards that prevent it from being countered in other ways. For example, if we have a Vexing Shusher, we can use Vexing Shusher's ability to make it so Dash Hopes can't be countered, which makes it so that its own triggered ability cannot counter itself. So that's an interesting interaction there. I don't think it's a relevant one, but it's worth mentioning because when we analyze the card, we're going into all the details. And the other thing you should maybe know is that paying 5 life is only something you can do if you have at least 5 life. So even if you have a card like Platinum Angel that would allow you to go to negative life, you cannot pay life if you do not have it. And in multiplayer games, you may want to know that when the triggered ability resolves, the active player gets the option to pay 5 life, and then it gets passed around in turn order until somebody chooses to pay 5 life or nobody pays 5 life. So if you cast this spell during your opponent's turn, they are the first one who gets to choose whether they want to pay 5 life. And if you're casting this card during your own turn, you're the one who gets to choose whether you would like to pay 5 life first or not. If that turns out to be relevant and you want to, you can pay the 5 life yourself. I just don't really see that as a realistic scenario. But anyways, moving on. Withering Boon is quite a bit older, but it's comparable because they're both 2 mana, and the original card is formatted very much obviously like an old card. This was printed in Mirage as an uncommon and has yet to be reprinted. It has the word interrupt on it, which I did discuss briefly in a previous video, but that is basically means that it's an instant, and at one point in time, there were cards that said interrupts and there were cards that said instants, and interrupts were specifically cards that were going to interact with other cards typically on the stack. So mostly counter spells. But it's also formatted a little strange in the text box because it says pay 3 life and then has the colon indicating, well, that it's a cost, counter target summon spell. But to be clear, you cannot pay 3 life more than once. This card has been reformatted, and now it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, pay 3 life, counter target creature spell, as opposed to the way it looks now. Okay, so Withering Boon, interesting card. Its most close comparison is obviously Remove Soul, but when you're in black, you've only got 2 options for counter spells. Dash Hopes is a conditional counter spell, so it's not really something you can rely on actually countering something, because if your opponent really wants it to resolve, they're going to pay 5 life. The only time this really becomes a true counterspell is when your opponent's at 5 or less life, or you're finagling it with something like Stifle, like I mentioned before, but this card is just not reliable compared to Withering Boon, which is a guaranteed remove soul, provided that you pay 3 life. That being said, Mirage is only legal in Eternal formats, and when you're in Eternal formats, there are much, much more powerful options than Remove Soul, let alone Withering Boon. That being said, let's jump into applications for the cards, because, I mean, they're still worth talking about, even if they might be a little underplayed for obvious reasons. Dash Hopes, I think, is a card that is unlikely to really get played anywhere, because in Commander, the 5 life is not very much. And also, because you are typically playing multiplayer in Commander, it means that any player at the table can pay 5 life. So if any player is benefited by letting that spell resolve, like for example, if it's a board wipe, there might be more than one player at the table that would like that spell to resolve. There's ample opportunity for people to counter Dash Hopes. I will briefly mention Oathbreaker as an upcoming format that people are enjoying. I might talk about it more in later videos, but Oathbreaker is a sort of like a Commander variant. I think some people might say it's its own thing, really. But Oathbreaker, people start at 20 life, which makes the 5 life a lot harder to play or pay, but it's still a multiplayer format, so it still suffers from that same problem. So Dash Hopes, if you're going to use it in your deck, you're not using it as a counter spell, you're using it as kind of a burn spell, because, well, you can't rely on it countering a spell, but you also can't rely on it doing the burn either. So it's a little weird. It's like you have a very powerful effect, like pay to target opponent loses 5 or pay to counter target spell are both really good, but your opponent picks whichever one suits them the best. So it's always going to be the worst version of itself, which is part of the reason why I don't think you'll really see this card anywhere, unless somehow mono black burn gets to be really good in some kind of niche format. I just don't see it. Withering Boon, on the other hand, unlikely to be played in any real competitive format, but we'll bring up Commander again. I think most people wouldn't play Withering Boon because they just don't really like it, and that your obvious go-to in black is going to be something like Doomblade to deal with creature. But Withering Boon does something that black cannot do, which is deal with cards that have hexproof or indestructible. It also is unconditional, with the exception of the 3 life, meaning most black destruction spells like Doomblade or Go for the Throat indicate a type of creature that they can't interact with. This can hit anything. And also, it's worth noting that when you counter a spell, you're not going to have to deal with its enter the battlefield effect. So, for example, something like a Craterhoof Behemoth, if that hits the battlefield, you may lose the game even if you destroy it with something like a Doomblade, because its enter the battlefield is going to happen, and that's really what people are playing the card for. So Withering Boon, I think you could make an argument for in Commander. It's just I don't think many people feel it's necessary, because it's very comfortable to just like run 2-mana destroy spells. This card is I think more difficult to use, and although it is better than something like a Doomblade in the Craterhoof scenario that I just created, those scenarios don't always pop up, whereas creatures always pop up, and it's easier to just kill the creature at your leisure than have to respond to it while it's on the stack. So that's why I think this card doesn't get played much, but I do think there's an argument that you could use it and make good use of it. So anyways, we have a giveaway again, and this giveaway altar is a different style of altar than the previous altars I've done, and I think it turned out very well. I'm actually going to make another video talking about how I altered this card, because I think people are going to find that quite interesting. It is a negate with a familiar face on it. And you can probably, well, maybe you can tell that this wasn't altered with paints. It's altered with markers. And I think that's worth making a second video on, because I think people are intimidated by working with paints, but markers are very approachable for a lot of people. So for people who are looking to try to alter some of their cards and want a low investment, both in terms of the amount of skill as well as the amount of stuff you need. Like, you don't need to go buy paintbrushes or paint. Most people have, some markers around their house, or I think that generally speaking, they're going to be a lot less expensive. So I will talk about that in another video. I'm hoping to see you guys in that video. If you would like a chance of winning this altar, I have a link in the description to the giveaway, and that's gonna do it for this one. It's been fun. Until next time, everybody, peace out.